Welcome to Lemon Stream, where we feature stories of the unknown, mysteries, post-apocalyptic fiction, and other weird stuff. So settle in, get comfortable, get ready. Here we go. The New World, Chapter 13. Oh dear. The next 2 weeks were gloomy ones. Gramps was gone. The adults were anxious about the neighbors they had met. The sky was cold and gray every day, without even a glimpse of sunshine. Colder weather had brought with it colds and coughs that managed to make people just a little more miserable. At least now they were able to spend days outside, and there was plenty of work to do to keep people busy. Stevie and Michael worked on getting together some firewood for the coming winter. There were plenty of dead trees and blowdowns to choose from. It was just a matter of the strenuous work of chopping and cutting, something they weren't accustomed to after so much time spent in the basement and bound to the house. Sandy's time was consumed with numerous repair projects on the house and garage, trying to fix things up and winterize the home. Darren monitored the shortwave and then went back and forth between helping Sandy and helping Michael and Stevie. Ma and Denise worked on finding ways to stretch meals, to wash clothes without soap, and to figure out sleeping arrangements so that each family in the group could have some space to themselves. Joe and Sylvia took care of the kids, starting a makeshift school program to teach the children. Shayla did little, except to point out what people were doing wrong. She pictured herself as a sort of foreman, trying to manage the work of everyone else when she wasn't napping or chewing somebody's ear off. She was especially good at coming up with not-so-creative insults for Michael. One brisk morning, Michael got up before the sun. He started a small fire in the wood stove to take the chill off, then sat down to have hot coffee with Darren. "What are you up to today?" Darren asked, sipping coffee. "Today," said Michael, "I'm hunting. I saw a deer yesterday when the sun was going down. It was by the crabapple trees up at the top of the hill behind the house. Just a little spike horn, but it sure would be good to have some fresh meat. I'm tired of canned chicken and Spam." "Oh, yeah," Darren nodded. "A nice tender deer steak, cooked with onions and potatoes. Maybe some gravy over those potatoes." He closed his eyes and shook his head. "It's been so long it seems like a dream." "I'm going to find him," Michael said. "I'm going up the hill, and hopefully he's still hanging around in the area. He's little, but he's the only one I've seen since all of this." "I suppose a lot of them died," Darren said. "Yeah," Michael agreed. "Too bad, too. We could use 3 or 4 for the winter." "How would we keep them?" Darren asked. "There's no electricity." "The old-timers," Michael said, "used to dress them out and hang them in the meat shed, late October or November. And then they'd eat off of them all winter. My dad told me about it, how his dad's family would do that on the farm. They'd put a couple deer and maybe a beef animal and some sausage patties packed in crocks every fall, and they would stay below freezing most of the time so it would keep. By the time weather warmed up in the spring, the meat would be pretty much gone anyway." "Wow," Darren said, nodding. "There's so much about how that generation lived that I wish we knew now. Everything done without modern conveniences and mostly with their own resources. Sure would be nice to know all of that now." "We've lost a lot," Michael agreed. "I used to think that we'd got far ahead in the modern world, but now I see how much we lost. So much knowledge, just gone. Stuff that would save our lives now." The men finished their coffee as a faint glow began to grow in the east. "I'm off now," Michael said. "I want to get to the top of the hill before there's much sunlight, if you can call it sunlight." He picked up a 308 and a closed travel mug with extra coffee and slipped quietly out the door. Michael climbed the small hill behind the house and sat down next to a rock. He scanned the woods on the backside of the hill. There was nothing. so he lay his rifle across his lap and opened the coffee, taking a small sip. There was something relaxing about sitting there alone in the woods. He loved his extended family, but after spending so much time in close quarters, it seemed like such a luxury to be sitting alone in silence. Sitting by the rock in the woods, sipping hot coffee, he could almost imagine that everything that had happened was nothing more than a dream, and the world was back the way it used to be. There was a rustling in the leaves. Michael peered through the woods again. A squirrel ran from one tree and up another. He sat back again. He remembered sitting in the living room playing his wrestling game on his Xbox, a beer on one side of him and a bowl of popcorn on the other, and his little girl on his lap. He smiled. The memory didn't seem real. It was from some old, distant life. The feelings were real. He wiped a tear from his eye. What kind of world would Afton be growing up in now? Michael was a big man. He was over 6 feet tall, and his biceps were as big as most people's thighs, but he felt so small and helpless. A twig snapped. He shook himself out of his daydream and peered through the leafless trees again. His heart beat faster. There it was! A little spike-horned white-tailed deer was walking through the woods about 100 feet away. The deer stopped and looked around, and put its head down and nuzzled the ground. Michael slowly lifted his rifle to his shoulder. With his thumb, he flicked the safety off. He looked intently through the scope. With the crosshairs on the animal's upper chest, he drew a deep breath, then exhaled. The rifle cracked and punched his shoulder. The buck jumped up and sprinted about 20 feet. Then its front legs collapsed and it tumbled to the ground, motionless. Michael jumped to his feet and ran to the deer, stumbling over a pile of small rocks, but staying on his feet. He reached the deer and looked at it. It was still motionless, its dark, lifeless eyes staring at the sky. Excited, he pulled out his buck knife and cut the hide right down the center of its belly, being careful not to cut into the abdominal sac. Reaching deep into the carcass, he skillfully cut the esophagus where it came down the neck, then cut the rear end of the large intestines where it connected to the anus. Carefully but deliberately, he slid the gut sac out of the deer and onto the ground. Then he went to work removing the lungs and the heart. Darren came up behind him. "Hey," he said, "you got it." "Yeah," said Michael, standing up and beaming with pride and excitement. "Want to help me get it down to the house? I'm not going to mess with the liver and heart. I just don't know if the organ meats are safe to eat under the circumstances. I don't know if any of it's safe to eat, but I'm having me a steak." Darren and Michael each grabbed one of the hind legs and dragged the deer up and over the little hill. Others were coming out of the house now, stirred by the sound of the gunshot. "A deer! A deer!" Timmy cried out, running up the hill to meet his father and Michael. "Real food!" Denise exclaimed. When they reached the house, they put the deer down. "Usually," said Michael, "I would hang the guy for 3 days. But I want steak. I'm cutting it up this morning." Over the next 2 hours, he skinned the deer and worked at separating the different cuts of meat. He was careful to get every scrap of meat, even what wasn't good for roast or steak, would be boiled down in a stew. Most of the meat was wrapped in sheets of paper and put in a crate in the garage, where it'd be left to chill and to freeze. Ma set up Gramps' pressure canner on the wood stove and canned the stew meat. Then she sent Michael back out with a saw to cut up the bones, which she boiled in batches to make broth. "We'll can the broth, too," she said. "That'll make some nice stew this winter." The group used much more precious firewood than usual that day, but the warmth and joy they felt was unmatched by anything they'd experienced since that day the world changed. At the end of the joyous day, after the children were put to bed, Michael went into the basement to the case of Chinese wine. He pulled out a bottle and took it upstairs. "Tonight," he said to the others, "we celebrate."